All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into what has to be one of the most absolutely audacious and honestly kind of baffling political experiments in human history. We're unpacking the European Union. I mean, think about it for a second. For pretty much all of recorded history, the story of Europe was just bloodshed, shifting empires, and endless territorial conquest. Fast forward to today, and it's a completely different reality. So how on earth did that happen? Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this right here is the ultimate post-World War II challenge. How do you take nations that have spent literal centuries locked in a brutal cycle of mutual destruction and get them to not just agree to a truce, but to actually share power and govern together? If you had pitched that idea to anyone living through the trenches of World War I or the bombings of World War II, they would have called you completely delusional. It defies everything we thought we knew about human nature and state sovereignty. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the European project, we've got to contrast the ashes of 1945 with where we are today. Close your eyes and picture Europe right at the end of the Second World War. It was total devastation. Economies were completely obliterated, borders were intensely militarized, and generational hatred was at an all-time high. Now, compare that to the modern era. We're looking at a peaceful continent with a massive, highly integrated single market. You can literally just drive from Lisbon to Berlin without ever showing a passport or changing your cash. It's a profound irony of history that former mortal enemies now intimately share a central bank. It's a monumental, highly improbable transformation.
So now that we see that massive transformation, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to explore the evolutionary arc of this incredible project across 6 quick chapters. Das cinzas à União, tratados e fundações, o crescimento do bloco, políticas na prática, a era das crises, and finally, União Europeia hoje.
All right, Chapter 1, Das cinzas à União, the origins of post-war cooperation. Our story kicks off in the absolute wreckage of 1945. The immediate priority back then wasn't just rebuilding shattered economies, it was figuring out a structural way to make sure a third world war could never happen. The real catalyst for this radical new approach was the U.S. Marshall Plan. By pumping billions of dollars in to rebuild infrastructure, the United States practically forced European nations to sit down and collaborate on how to distribute the funds. And that planted this wildly innovative seed. The idea that if you make rival nations economically interdependent, going to war isn't just illegal, it becomes materially impossible. You simply can't afford to bomb the factory you rely on.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer audacity of how they actually pulled this off. In 1951, spearheaded by visionary figures, 6 nations signed a pact creating the CECA, the European Coal and Steel Community. By pooling their coal and steel production, they were literally taking the physical ingredients needed to build tanks and wage war and putting them under joint control. It was an absolute masterstroke of geopolitical strategy. They neutralized military competition by entirely removing a single nation's sovereign control over the tools of destruction and turned those very tools into the raw materials for shared prosperity.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, Tratados e Fundações, the blueprints of unity.
What's super fascinating here is the absolute political snowball effect this early cooperation triggered. That first win with coal and steel, it wasn't just some localized economic deal. Just 6 years later, in 1957, the Treaty of Rome set up a much broader common market. The appetite for unity was just growing exponentially. And all this momentum eventually led to a massive leap forward in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty. This is the exact turning point where the project morphed from a purely economic community into a true, legally binding political union, setting the stage for everything we recognize about the EU today.
Maastricht was revolutionary because it pushed integration way past just trade and tariffs. I mean, setting up the framework for the euro currency was a titanic achievement, and establishing a common foreign policy shifted the global balance of power. But arguably the most radical shift was the creation of European citizenship. Think about what that actually means. It effectively erased functional borders for everyday people, giving them this unprecedented legal right to just pack up and live or work anywhere within the bloc. It completely challenged the rigid idea of national identity. You weren't solely defined as French or German or Italian anymore. You were given a dual layer of identity. You became European.
Chapter 3, O crescimento do bloco, expanding the borders. And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. With the foundational treaties firmly in place, the bloc turned its attention outward.
And in 2004, the EU pulled off an act of sheer geopolitical ambition, the historic Big Bang expansion. 10 countries joined the Union simultaneously. What's critical here is that most of these nations were from Central and Eastern Europe. So this wasn't just administrative expansion. This was the geopolitical triumph of finally pulling post-Soviet sphere nations firmly into the Western democratic and economic fold. It fundamentally reunited a continent that had been physically and ideologically chopped in half by the Cold War.
But as you might guess, integration of that magnitude doesn't happen without some major friction. Marrying wealthy Western economies with post-communist nations was a colossal hurdle. Every single new member state had to adopt the acervo comunitario, which is basically the entire accumulated body of EU law. We are talking about harmonizing thousands upon thousands of pages of strict regulations covering everything from fundamental human rights to exactly how a banana should be classified and measured. It was a massive bureaucratic culture shock that deeply tested social cohesion, heavily pressured the central budget, and created institutional bottlenecks, forcing a union originally designed for 6 countries to figure out how to compromise with nearly 30.
Chapter 4, Políticas na Prática. Let's look at how the EU actually affects daily life.
So how does this grand, theoretical, political project actually touch the lives of hundreds of millions of citizens on the ground? Well, let's look at the PAC, the Common Agricultural Policy. This has been one of the most massive and honestly sometimes controversial pillars of the EU, historically eating up a huge chunk of its total budget. Back when it was established in 1962, the goal was incredibly straightforward: make sure a recently devastated continent could simply feed itself. Fast forward to today, and the PAC has totally transformed. It's now right at the absolute center of Europe's climate strategy, navigating the friction of shifting subsidies away from old-school bulk farming over to radical green legislation and biodiversity. Then we have the cohesion policy, which represents the very real, often debated concept of European solidarity. Through specialized funds, the EU actively takes wealth from its richest member states and funnels it into local infrastructure, social projects, and tech hubs in its poorest regions. The ultimate goal is convergence, ensuring no region is left behind. But it creates a really fascinating dynamic. A taxpayer in a wealthy nation is essentially funding a new bridge or a hospital in a developing region thousands of miles away. It's a continuous, tricky balancing act between fostering genuine continental solidarity and managing the local political resentments that almost inevitably pop up when money crosses borders.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Chapter 5, Era das Crises, the massive stress tests of the 2010s.
So, after decades of optimism and relentless integration, the Union slammed into a wall of brutal reality. The first massive shockwave was the 2008 financial crisis. The resulting contagion tore through Europe, triggering deep recessions. The Union was forced to rapidly invent bailout mechanisms to save the Eurozone, but it came at a really steep price. Vulnerable nations were subjected to incredibly strict austerity measures. This ignited an intensely polarized debate and deep political tensions between Northern and Southern Europe over the moral and economic balance between demanding strict financial discipline and providing necessary social welfare rescue. Hot on the heels of the financial crash came the 2015 refugee crisis. Millions of people, displaced by brutal conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, desperately sought safety in Europe. This humanitarian emergency put an immense breaking point strain on the Schengen area's fundamental promise of open borders. It sparked deeply emotional debates all over the continent regarding mandatory relocation quotas, national security, and cultural identity. It was a profound stress test that directly fueled the rise of populist movements and severely questioned the very limits of European solidarity. And then, in 2016, the absolute unthinkable happened: Brexit. In a profoundly historic referendum, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union by a margin of 51.9%. When the exit was officially finalized in 2020, the psychological shock to the bloc was just immeasurable. For the entire history of the project, integration was assumed to be a one-way street, an ever-closer union that only expanded. Brexit completely shattered that illusion. For the very first time, a major economic and military power decided that the costs of union outweighed the benefits, fundamentally challenging the permanence of the entire European project.
Finally, Chapter 6, A União Europeia Hoje, the modern bloc.
Surviving that relentless crucible of overlapping crises brings us to the modern 27-member union. Governing a bloc of this size, it requires a grinding, constant, yet somehow functional tug of war. The power is carefully distributed,
You've got the European Parliament directly representing the citizens. You have the Council fiercely representing the sovereign interests of the individual member states. And then you have the Commission acting as the centralized executive branch. Literally, every single directive, law, and budget is this delicate, hard-fought compromise between protecting absolute national sovereignty and advancing the collective European good.
So, the crucial point is that the EU is never static. It is constantly being forced to evolve. And today's challenges are monumental. The bloc is trying to navigate an increasingly fractured, multipolar geopolitical landscape. It's dealing with post-pandemic economic recovery while simultaneously managing the profound security impacts of a war right on its doorstep in Ukraine. And at the exact same time, it is attempting to execute the European Green Deal, aiming to completely transition an entire continent to a climate-neutral economy. These massive pressures are forcing the EU to pivot from just being an economic powerhouse into a much more assertive, strategic, geopolitical actor.
Ultimately, looking at this totally remarkable evolutionary arc, we are left with one vital question. Is the EU ready for the future? Has navigating the brink of financial collapse, a massive refugee emergency, and the historic shock of Brexit forged a union that is resilient enough to thrive in tomorrow's multipolar world? Or are the internal frictions simply too vast? It remains one of the most fascinating, high-stakes experiments in international cooperation in human history, and its next chapter is literally being written right now. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.